a brief overview of the assessment models that are in the annual updates that we do every year. I'm not going to talk about benchmark assessment, which is coming up and which there will be some additional work done, but just a broad brush overview of the ones that we do every year. So first I want to talk about the CSA model, which is sort of redundancy because it stands for colony system-wide analysis or catch survey analysis, and I just thought it'd be fun to show the colleague and the Sisson-Wine who were the authors of this paper that was written, I think, in the 80s, and developed the model that we're applying to shrimp. And so this is the main model that we use to assess the shrimp every year. And the work I'm going to be talking about today actually was all pretty much developed by Steve Cadron in the late 1990s when he started working on northern shrimp. And he did a lot of really nice work to develop applications of models towards shrimp, which had been assessed on just an index basis before that time. And so he not only set up these models that have been used ever since and had a good track record with the shrimp, but he also did a lot of testing of the models using simulated data and so forth. So this really all builds on Steve Cadron's work, even though he's not in that picture. All right, so the main reason that we do this CSA is to estimate the number of shrimp in the population each year. And Maggie talked about how we use relative indices and that they go up and down as the size of the population goes up and down. But they're not telling us how many shrimp are in the population. They're only telling us what the trends are. So we want to take those trends and translate them into absolute numbers so that we can then use those numbers over time to estimate fishing mortality rates or total mortality rates, and then evaluate the stock status and project what might be the safe fishing levels, the tax for the coming season. So that's why we do the CSA. And why do we use this particular model? Of course, there are lots and lots of models that could potentially be applied to shrimp, and some of the reasons that CSA is a really useful model for shrimp are these. It's relatively simple. It's not a highly complex, deeply structured model. It's pretty simple, and it's not age-based, but it does take into account the size structure in the population. So, in other words, how many how many shrimp are coming into the population, how many are coming into the fishery, and so forth. So it takes some accounting of the size structure in the population, but it's not very detailed, and it's not age-based since we can't age shrimp aside from looking at the length composition. You saw in Maggie's length plots that there are humps that are associated with different ages, we think, but once they get to those larger sizes, all those modes that we call those bumps are all smeared, and it's very hard to determine an age of a shrimp. So the CSA does not rely on aging, and that's a very good thing for us. The other thing is that it integrates both fishery and survey information, and that's important. Those are our two primary sources of information, and so we want to use them both. And the other thing is that Steve Cadron did a lot of work testing these models on simulated data, so he would create data where you knew what the answer was, and then he would run the models and see if they came up to close to the answers that you knew it should be, and they performed very well. So that's another, and also it's had a pretty good track record over time now that we are probably, 15 years past when Steve first started applying these. So those are reasons why we like CSA, because it works and it's fairly simple. And that's actually important for a species where you do an annual update, because it's still quite a lot of work. But so these are the data inputs to the CSA. There's commercial data from the commercial fishery, including the commercial catch. And then we also, very important, is an estimate of the average weight of a shrimp in the catch each year, because that's used to translate the landings in weight in pounds to landings in numbers of shrimp. So those data come from the commercial sampling that Maggie talked about. And then the other thing is that we have survey indices for two size classes of shrimp, and I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute. And these survey, at this point, the survey indices used in the CSA are from the summer survey. And the reason for that is primarily because we think that survey is probably the best indicator of the stock status of the shrimp for all the reasons that Maggie talked about and we discussed. However, as an aside, I think Katie's going to talk about this, we are expanding the CSA to include other surveys as well. But that won't happen until the benchmark assessment next year. And then the final thing that we need is to assume a natural mortality rate that is input to the model. So here's the basic idea behind the CSA model. And this is very similar to what Maggie was showing before. It's just a different picture. And so what we have is we want to know the number of shrimp that are going to be available to the fishery in a given year. So that is equal to the number of harvestable size shrimp that were left at the end of last year, plus any shrimp that grow into harvestable size during the year by the time the fishery occurs. And then you subtract the catch from last year, or during the year, catch from last year, and that leaves you, and then deaths due to natural mortality, and then that leaves you with the number of shrimp that are going to be available at the beginning of the fishery in the next year. And the next slide shows it in a different way. So say this is your population at the beginning of the year, and it's composed of a bunch of shrimp that are big shrimp that are going to be available to the fishery. It also has a bunch of shrimp that are too small for the fishery, maybe a couple of size classes. And just looking at this part of the population, so the fish that are big enough to be caught by the fishery are, the population is reduced by those that are caught and those that die of natural mortality. So you're taking a bunch of those fish out. Sorry, I keep calling them fish. I do work on fish too. And so at the end of the year, you have leftovers from those shrimp. And then the shrimp that were not big enough at the beginning of the year to be caught, some of those grow. Not all of them grow into a size that could be captured, but some of them do. And those also can be dying from natural mortality or taken out by catch. So you don't end up with all of them at the end of the year, but some subset. So at the end of the year, your harvestable population is the sum of this plus this. And that is basically the idea between CSA. You're trying to model those components and fit them all together in one picture. And that's how it works. Yes?
So let me understand a little bit about your catch size structure and how that goes into this model. So okay. Is it only used in converting the average pounds so you can convert back to number of shrimp and then back to a TAC? Or do you also use it to kind of determine the size, like the size of shrimp available to harvest?
Okay, so this comes from the survey size structure. And the sampling from the commercial landings determines this mean weight, the mean weight in the catch. So the number that determines the numbers caught.
Okay.
So that comes into this part. So we have an estimate of, we're estimating Q basically. So we have an estimate of the numbers in the population. We have an estimate of the numbers in the catch. So this comes from survey and that comes from catch sampling.
I guess I'm just wondering if they're catching small shrimp, I guess I'm just wondering if there's any sort of issue around determining the harvestable size shrimp. If they're catching a larger portion.
Well, there's a selectivity function. There's a selectivity function that goes into this.
There is, okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. Oh, this is the old one. Well, this is too complicated. I'm going to skip this slide. I think I explained it well enough. The last one. All right, so the other CSA input that we don't know is the rate of natural mortality, and I know there's a big deal about this last year. And in the past, so the rate of natural mortality is the shrimp that died due to natural causes, either predation, disease, whatever, maybe they just get old and they die. And in the past, starting in the late 90s when this was first developed, an M of a value of 0.25 was used in the assessment. And this was based on estimates that were done. One of them was looking at the rate at which the shrimp died when the fishery was closed. So there was no fishing mortality at all. All the mortality was due to natural causes. This was in the 70s. And so that estimate was something around 0.25. And so that was adopted. What was it? Oh, 0.17? Oh, it's 0.17, Meg says, but 0.25 was used. So that is the value that has been used. However, in the in the 2007 benchmark assessment review with the peer review, there was some work done looking at consumption of shrimp by predators. And the model suggested that the M must be higher because of the predation, the estimates from the predation studies. And it also, for a species that only lives 5 years, you generally would expect M to be higher, except for that maybe M is really high in the low stages and in the early stages and the late stages, and maybe in the middle it's more lower. But at any rate, so the base run still uses the M equals 0.25, but we do also have, I think since that assessment, I don't know, I've only been on the committee this is my second year, so since that last assessment, there have been runs also done at M equals 0.4 and M equals 0.6. So we do look at a range of values. So, okay. All right, so what do we get from the CSA? Like I said, we wanted to get estimates of population size and biomass in each year. And then from that, the mortality rates are estimated by CSA. And that allows evaluation of stock status and can project the levels of catch for the next year, given an estimate of what the size of the shrimp are going to be in the coming winter. So, okay, the other model that is routinely updated and has been since the late 90s is it's called ASPIC, which stands for, let's see, a stock...
a surplus production model incorporating covariance.
Yes, thank you. ASPIC. And it's also referred to as a biomass dynamics model, and the reason they call it that is that it's modeling how biomass changes over time. And this was done originally as sort of a second line of modeling to look at in conjunction with the CSA. It's never been the primary model for reasons that I'll talk about. But again, this is a very simple model. It's even more simple than the CSA because it doesn't incorporate any considerations of the structure of the population. Are there a lot of little shrimp? Are there a lot of big shrimp? And so forth. It's just looking at changes in biomass or the total weight of the shrimp in the population over time. It involves no assumption about natural mortality. Everything is just built into this. It's like a black box, basically. A good thing about this, the way this model has been configured, is that it can include multiple survey indices. So we can look at doing it with just the summer survey. We can add in the NIMS fall survey. We can add in inshore trawl surveys that Maine and New Hampshire do. And what else do we do? Anything else? Yeah, we don't use the spring NIMS survey. But the drawback is that, and I go into this a bit more later. This must be my old presentation. Is that it can be unreliable for estimating absolute biomass, but it's better at tracking trends. So, all right. So the inputs for ASPIC is the total catch. This is theoretically landings plus discard, but we don't think discarding is very high in the shrimp fishery. Don't discard. Do we discard? Yeah. So it's really just the landings in weight, and then the survey indices that I mentioned before. So this is, again, like what Maggie was saying, that this is how biomass of the shrimp changes over time. There are two processes that add to the biomass. That one is growth of individual shrimp. Shrimp grow over time. And the other way that the biomass is added to is that shrimp reproduce and put more shrimp into the population. And the way that the biomass is reduced is either through catch or through natural mortality. And now the other two things that can affect the biomass, of course, are immigration from other populations or emigration out and away from the area, and that's something that I know you folks are concerned about. We haven't, this is not accounted for in the population, and because we don't have any real evidence that we have a big exodus or anything, or immigration. Okay? All right, so the point of ASPIC is that ideally the model predicts how much catch can be removed while keeping the biomass constant. Now, how can that be? How can you take out catch and have the biomass be constant? Well, it's because of those processes on that previous slide, and also because of the magic of density dependence. And that means, this sort of illustrates, this is a plot of biomass versus how productive the shrimp population is. So when there is a high biomass of shrimp, the rate of increase in the population is actually pretty low, because can be processes like competition either within the shrimp population, or if there's a lot of shrimp, they may attract more predation. Maybe each individual fish doesn't grow as well, each shrimp. And so the population is not actually as productive as it could be if it was actually fished down a little bit. And so if you remove a bunch of this population from catch, then you're at a higher productivity level, and this is maximum sustainable yield right there. But if you get too far in the if you remove too much of the biomass, your productivity declines again. So it's basically trying to help you find that sweet spot where you're going to get the right catch. The pros and cons of ASPIC. Again, it's a simple model. It has relatively few data requirements, and that's a really nice thing. It can use, as I said, multiple indices, and we do that. It could be extended to include predation pressure and environmental effects, which we maybe will be pursuing for the next benchmark, possibly. It can be used to derive MSY-based, maximum sustainable yield-based reference points, which is a different approach than what's being used right now. According to this work that Steve Cadron did in about millennium, it does a reasonably good job of tracking trends in the biomass. However, there are some pretty significant cons, and a big one is that the estimates of biomass, absolute estimates of biomass, even though they track the trends well, they tend to be fairly well biased. In other words, they're not telling us the true level of the population. And this is a general property of these types of models, and often what's done because of this is that they're only used to track trends, not to used in reference points. And they're not used in shrimp reference points anywhere in the North Atlantic, even though some populations of shrimp do produce results from the assessments do include the ASPIC model. They're not used in reference points for this exact reason. So, and as Steve Cadron said in another paper, is that stock status determination based on ASPIC can be misleading because of this problem with these models. And one of the issues, one of the reasons for this is that shrimp, especially in the Gulf of Maine, shrimp recruitment, or the number of shrimp that are produced each year, new shrimp, is extremely variable. And this kind of model that is a sort of a mass balance model doesn't respond very well to that. That's a big problem for these kind of models, and it's a very prominent feature in the Gulf of Maine, as you all know, that the recruitment varies.
Questions for Anne? And I had a question. So with the CSA, you have you're modeling two different sizes of shrimp, so it's able,
size classes, yeah.
So it's able to incorporate some sort of level of recruitment. Is that
right?
Why it?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. So CSA, because it's modeling these two size classes of shrimp, it's actually looking, instead of assuming a given recruitment from a given biomass of females, it's actually looking at what are the observed recruitments coming into the fishery. So in that way, it calibrates more closely to the stock conditions that we see in the data.
And it does that based on a certain size, so obviously smaller shrimp are the juveniles that are recruiting,
Right.
and the larger shrimp are
Right.
the exploitable.
Right. Yeah, it looks at the ones that will recruit that coming year into the fishery. Yeah. Yes.
The CSA model is dynamic in the respect that it's not as we started looking at it in the early 90s to what we're using today. We've gone to transform numbers. We've changed different ways in which it's assessed.
Well, I don't think I'm quite sure that Steve. Well, I don't know. I wasn't there, but
I was there.
I'd be
I was
very
there.
surprised
I
if they
was-
didn't use log transform.
I was there.
Okay,
So-
because the model structure basically requires you log transform it.
That's why it didn't work, and so they had to do changes to make it work.
Okay.
So it is dynamic. It has gone through changes. Goes through changes. I think almost every year that you run it, you take a different approach to it. My question goes back to, and you mentioned at the beginning here, is the kind of the holy grail coming out of the peer review, and looking at how we do our science and making recommendations about how we can do it better. And then I assume that we're supposed to follow that to make sure that we adhere to what that recommendation is, only because that's what the peer review, that's what it's supposed to do. And I don't know if we have time now before lunch, but hopefully, if we don't, we can follow up on this. And that the last peer review in 2007, there were a number of recommendations made. We can review what the technical committee did to follow those recommendations and what the impact of that was.
Okay. The last peer review, and there's a lot of misconception about it, but it accepted the assessment. It said that we had met our terms of reference. It said that we were assessing the stock appropriately. It did recommend that we start looking at using higher values of M, which we have done, and we have reported that every year in the appendix of the assessment ever since. It also recommended that we look at length-based models, which the CSA is, but it's sort of a simplified one. And at the time, shortly after that benchmark, the TC met, and we said, well, should we start working on a new model? And the message that I got from the other members was the managers are not asking for a new model. The industry is not asking for a new model. We don't have money to develop a new model. So we just sort of put that aside for the times. We have a huge, long wish list as researchers of things that we'd like to do, and that was on the list. But it wasn't, a direct command from the peer review to throw out our model and use a new one. It was, gee, you ought to look at. Since then, there has been some interest from the section, the managers, in developing a new model. There's been interest from the industry, and Maine has made some money available to develop a length-based.
No, go ahead.
To develop a length-based model, so we are going to do that. But we feel that we have met what that peer review had asked us to do for that peer review and for the future.
I mean, as I read the recommendations of the peer review, it was that not only consider a larger or increase in the M, but also the reference points associated with that increase. That was the recommendation. I think they also recommended looking at the way we perform our survey and taking into consideration the impact of spatial distribution that we have, as well as a number of other recommendations. So I would assume that the recommendations from the SART would carry enough weight that they would be initiated as soon as possible. And to another point, Maggie, is that we, industry, at least from the processors section, have been concerned about the CSA model since 1992. And every year
it's been through 3 peer reviews.
I know, but to not say that the industry has not pushed to have a look at these models and the issues that we do have with these models. I just want to clarify that is that we have, that we've been consistent about it.
And if they weren't appropriate, the peer review, believe me, they would have told us. I mean, they have rejected assessments and said, go back.
I'm not saying that, but they also put conditions of what they would like to see happen.
Well, they always give you this laundry list of things you ought to do that,
Well,
that would just.
it's the whole. I mean, to us, it's the holy grail. We can't do anything. You keep saying you can't do anything. You have peer review, right? But then to say they give us a whole laundry list of da 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 da.
We should look at this and this and this and
Yeah,
this.
well,
You
to
know, it
me,
takes
to
resources.
me, that's pretty significant. I mean, I don't see how you can accept it at one side and then dismiss it on another side.
So did the technical committee explore some alternative biological reference points recently? I think.
Oh, I think we're going to talk about that in
Yeah,
the
I guess
afternoon.
that's
But if you use a higher value of M, it does change all the reference points, but it doesn't change where you are relative to the stable period. Are we going to talk
Well,
about
good.
that?
I hope we get into the stable period. But,
Get into anything you want.
We certainly have considered how it would change the reference points, but since our reference points are based on a period in time that's included in our time series, changing M doesn't change where you are relative to where, you know, back during the stable period, it just wasn't a good idea to catch more than 4,000 or 5,000 metric tons. It's still not a good idea. It doesn't matter whether that gives you enough of 0.08 or 0.25.
Right.
It's
I think we're going to cover a lot of this in the future, in the next setting, including presentations on how we set the quota and what we're going to do for the next benchmark assessment, which is coming up this year.